Nehemiah chapter 6 as we consider this morning when distractions threaten success. I believe that the name of Thomas Edison is probably well known to every one of us. I think that we benefit from some of his inventions probably every single day. As you know, he is considered one of the most successful inventors of all times. But the backstory of his life is that he was an unlikely success. For one thing, he was the last born of 7 sons and daughters, coming from very humble means. We know that he had some very serious hearing issues, and by the time he became an adult, he was pretty much deaf. If he were alive today, he probably would have been diagnosed as ADD, attention deficit disorder. He was a very hyperactive kid. He was a distraction-prone child, so much that even his mother pulled him out of public school at the age of 12 after he had attended for only 12 weeks. Not a very promising start. But he was a man who did not know the meaning of the word quit. And here are a few of the things that he said. He said that our greatest weakness lies in giving up. The most certain way to succeed is always to try just one more time. He also said that many of life's failures are people who did not realize how close they were to success when they gave up. And this last one I think I like especially. He said, I have not failed. I've just found 10,000 ways that won't work. Nehemiah, whom we've been studying in recent weeks, would have been a kindred spirit in that sense, in the fact that he did not know the meaning of the word quit. Amidst countless efforts to intimidate him and frustrate and infuriate and paralyze him with fear, he never, ever gave up. So look with me in the first 3 verses this morning of Nehemiah chapter 6. It says, Now when it was reported to Sanballat, Tobiah, to Geshem the Arab, and to the rest of our enemies, that I had rebuilt the wall, and that no breach remained in it, although at that time I had not set up the doors in the gates, then Sanballat and Geshem sent a message to me saying, Come, let us meet together at Shepharim in the plain of Ono. But they were planning to harm me. So I sent messengers to them saying, I am doing a great work, and I cannot come down. Why should the work stop while I leave it and come down to you? It's been said that we are most prone to distraction when we are the closest to success. If we, like Nehemiah, are opposed by an enemy, then that enemy knows it is much, much easier to derail something before it is completed than to do so after there's some momentum after something has been completed. As we read here, the wall was completed. There was just one task that remained, and that was to install the gates. And so we get the idea that success is within reach for Nehemiah and the workers. The enemy, once again, wants to frustrate those efforts. And so the plan is the distraction of a meeting. They're trying to call out Nehemiah to come and meet with them and to discuss some things. We understand that the place where they wanted to meet was probably about 20 miles from Jerusalem. And it was a very pleasant place, kind of a retreat setting. A place called Ono. Somebody once said Nehemiah had the good sense to say no to Ono. Something to think about. A plot was hatched that they were going to ambush and no doubt kill Nehemiah before he made it to that meeting. So I want you to notice the motto of Nehemiah, a man who could not be distracted. I love this. He says, I am doing a great work, and I cannot come down. In other words, I'm doing a great work and I refuse to be distracted. And I'm thinking that's a phrase you ought to pull out of Scripture, print out. And this is one of those that we ought to look at on a regular basis because it applies to us as well. I am doing a great work. We are doing a great work. And we cannot be distracted either. We will not be distracted either. It reminds me of Matthew 6:33, where the great priority of believers is to seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and everything else is secondary. Everything else will be added to it. And so that's our great work. So let's make sure then that we are focused on doing that great work and not letting anything distract us from that. Here's a sobering thought in terms of distraction. The most dangerous distractions are the good opportunities that would pull us away from God's best. That's where things are challenging. Rarely is the strong temptation to do the bad at the expense of the good. Not to say that we're not tempted by bad things, but given a clear objective choice, we can pretty easily sort out bad from good and say, this is the choice that I should make. Choosing good and choosing the best over good is something more difficult and more challenging to make sure that good does not take the place of the best that God has designed for us. So we think about Nehemiah's situation here. What would have been wrong with taking a little break from all the hard work that he'd been doing? And so this call to a meeting sounded like an okay, good thing. And so what would have been wrong with that? The enticement sounded innocent enough, but we understand it would have been absolutely disastrous. Namely, if he'd have gone along with it, he'd have lost his life and the work would have been forfeited. Nehemiah knew that the very best work was to continue rebuilding that wall, repairing that which in God's realm was broken, and absolutely nothing was going to deter Nehemiah from that. And so this effort to distract and to divert him failed. But you know, when one effort by the enemy fails, it's time to try something else. So you look in verses 4 to 9 with me here, and we might say tactic number 2 by the enemy. It says in verse 4 that they sent messages to me 4 times in this manner, and I answered them in the same way. That's the first mention here, call for a meeting. So they've sent him 4 messages to that meeting. He's answered the same way every time. Verse 5 says, then Sanballat sent his servant to me in the same manner a 5th time. Things are a little different now. With an open letter, it says, in his hand. In it was written, this is the contents of the letter. It is reported, according to the letter, it is reported among the nations, and Geshem says that you and the Jews are planning to rebel. Therefore, you are rebuilding the wall, and you are to be their king, according to these reports. You have also appointed prophets to proclaim in Jerusalem concerning you, a king is in Judah. And now it will be reported to the king according to these reports. So come now, let us take counsel together. Then Nehemiah says, I sent a message to him saying, such things as you are saying have not been done, but you are inventing them in your own mind. For all of them were trying to frighten us, thinking they will become discouraged with the work, and it will not be done. But now, O God, strengthen my hands. The enemy tried once to distract Nehemiah. It didn't work, but they continued on. It says 4 different times that they're rather persistent in what they're trying to do. But then this 5th effort, we see that things are certainly escalated. The 5th letter is an open letter with a very serious accusation. Nehemiah is going to set himself up to be king. He's got all the arrangements made, and this goes against King Artaxerxes, whom he'd been cupbearer for. And so it sounds like a very dangerous, serious plot Kind of like trying to storm the U.S. Capitol, so to speak, if we think of contemporary terms. So basically what the writer is saying, Nehemiah, this time you for sure had better come down from working on the wall, because we absolutely have to have a meeting to talk about this very serious issue. As if to say, we didn't get your attention those other times, saying, let's just have a meeting. Let's talk about this very serious matter as to why we now need to have a meeting. And I want you to notice in verses 8 to 9, here's how a godly man responds. We learn so much about Nehemiah's character in all of this letter. Here's how a godly man responds. For one thing, he dismisses the accusations. He saw them for what they were. You've invented these things. You've made this up in your own mind. And he knows what it is that they are about. These are efforts merely to frighten him and them, to discourage and to discontinue this work that they desperately want to have stopped. And I notice again a response of this man of prayer. All throughout in our studies so far, we see how much Nehemiah is really a man of prayer. Here's another one of his bullet prayers, so to speak, that goes along with his continual practice of prayer. Notice what he's saying. But now, O God, strengthen my hands. There's a temptation to not work. There's a temptation to be distracted. There's a temptation to come down. Strengthen my hands, God. I know this is a great work, and I want to continue on. So again, the enemy's efforts fail. And so if another tactic fails, well, let's try another one. So look in verses 10 to 14. This time it says that he entered the house of a certain individual, Shemaiah. And because I have trouble sometimes with words, it just tells us here who his father and grandfather were. And this man was confined at home, it says here in verse 10. And he said, let us meet together in the house of God within the temple, and let us close the doors of the temple. For they are coming to kill you, and they are coming to kill you at night. Some translations say coming to kill you tonight. So there's an urgency there. But I said, should a man like me flee? And could one such as I go into the temple to save his life? I will not go in. Then I perceived that surely God had not sent him, but he uttered his prophecy against me because Tobiah and Sanballat had hired him. He was hired for this reason, that I might become frightened and act accordingly and sin, so that they might have an evil report in order that they could reproach me. Remember, O my God, Tobiah and Sanballat, according to these works of theirs, and also Noadiah, the prophetess, and the rest of the prophets who were trying to frighten me. So the other enemy tactics haven't worked out too well. So here's a more subtle tactic being used. We have this individual who it says is confined to home. I would take that to mean that he was crippled, handicapped. And so the first thing you would think, especially if you're Nehemiah, is, well, how harmful could this individual be sitting in a wheelchair, if that were the case? And he says, let's meet in the temple. Well, what could be wrong with that? Let's go to the house of God. Let's meet together there. That sounds innocent enough. And he says, Nehemiah, let's barricade ourselves there. It's a great place of safety because they're coming to kill you. Nehemiah's response is, could one such as I go to the temple? And it's a very interesting question, because some believe that Nehemiah, because he was a cupbearer to the king, this was a rather common practice, that Nehemiah probably had been made a eunuch in order to be a cupbearer to the king. And God's law prohibited a eunuch from entering into God's tabernacle and temple. So we see what the real danger is. Not only would Nehemiah be taking the coward's way out by going in there, closing the door, and barricading himself in the temple, not only that, he would blatantly be disobeying God's law. He would be discredited in the eyes of people and in the eyes of God if he were to do these things. Once again, Nehemiah, I believe God inspired him to have this kind of discernment, saw through the plot. And somehow he came to realize that this man had been hired. And so here was a hired enemy. And once again, notice, we have a prayerful response from him in verse 14. Remember, oh my God, remember these men and what they have done and what they are attempting to do. So in spite of heavy opposition, in spite of all these attempts to distract, here's the bright spot in this chapter. Mission accomplished. Verses 15 and 16. It says, so the wall was completed on the 25th day of the month of Elul in 52 days. And when all our enemies heard of it and all the nations surrounding us saw it, it says they lost their confidence. For they recognized that this work had been accomplished with the help of our God. I want you to notice the mention of 52 days. A few weeks ago, we talked about the dimensions of the wall of Jerusalem that they were rebuilding. It was a monumental task. Here they were working day and night, tremendous odds. And in 52 days, they managed to rebuild the wall. Truly an amazing miracle. Especially when you consider the fact that Nehemiah was not a professional contractor or builder, and the workers were not skilled laborers. Truly an amazing miracle attributed to the fact that God had accomplished it through them. But when I think about how they were not qualified as workers to have done this, much less in the time that they did, it reminds me of 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 27. This says, God has chosen what is foolish in the world to shame the wise, and God has chosen what is weak in the world to shame the strong. Certainly that's what's happened here concerning the enemies of Nehemiah and the enemies of God. I want you to notice the effect of the completed wall upon these enemies who are trying their very best to discourage the task from being done. It says they lost their confidence. The very thing they were trying to do to Nehemiah and the workers, it's come back upon them. Now that the job is done, miraculously so, in a short amount of time, they now have lost their confidence. The very thing that they've been wanting to have happen to Nehemiah. You'd think that would be the end of the story if they lost their confidence. But in spite of the success, what we might call Operation Intimidation continues on. Verses 17 to 19 to round out the chapter. It says, also in those days many letters went from the nobles of Judah to Tobiah, and Tobiah's letters came to them. And many in Judah were bound by oath to him because he was the son-in-law of Shechaniah, the son of Erah, and his son, boy, I sure hate reading through these names, who had married a certain daughter and so forth. Moreover, they were speaking about his good deeds in my presence and reporting my words to him. And then Tobiah sent letters to frighten me. Aside of all those words that I couldn't pronounce, the main thing to know is he was an insider. He was one of them, one of the Jewish people. And he had a great deal of respect by others. And he continued his efforts to try to discourage this work that was being carried out. He sent letters to frighten me. So we might say the warfare continued. As I step back from this chapter, the thing that really stands out to me is that everything that we've looked at here, this entire chapter, is a picture of the spiritual warfare that we as believers face on a regular basis. This is kind of a blueprint of what the enemy tries to do to us. And so that's where this becomes very, very personal. I'm always reminded of Ephesians chapter 6 that talks about the warfare and the weapons of the warfare that we would have and so forth that we should put on. But certainly we have an enemy, like Nehemiah had. We have an enemy who is bent on distracting us from a great work. We know that to be true. He resorts to some very similar tactics like deceit and efforts to try to discredit us, as Nehemiah's enemies tried to do to him. And we know that we also have an enemy who will literally hire those, recruit those, who will also try to frighten us. Sometimes even finds those on the inside, maybe those who masquerade around as believers and are not, who will also try to frighten, intimidate, and discourage us from our great work. Once again, the efforts of our enemy are unrelenting and varied, as we've been learning here in chapter 6. There are enticements to distraction. There are veiled and open threats, deceit and false accusations, subtle attempts to discredit us. Again, efforts to frighten us, to discourage us. I think of the first effort that we read about in this chapter, a call to a meeting. And what was the purpose of a meeting if they were to actually have that meeting, if they didn't ambush and kill Nehemiah first? If they were to have a meeting, it was probably to reach some kind of an agreement, to come to some sort of unity. You know, like, why can't we all get along? And that bumper sticker I just absolutely hate to see on a regular basis. It says, coexist with all the symbols of all the religions. Let's somehow set aside our differences and let's see if we can't come to some sort of an agreement. All these things that can derail us from the very best work of the gospel and the work for the kingdom of God, to try to hammer out some kind of a unity that no doubt will involve compromise. And that's what the enemy so often wants to do with us. Through persuasive arguments with others, let's just get people together and somehow let's set aside some of these differences. That's exactly what he wants, is for us to compromise. And so certainly that's one of the tactics used against us. Nehemiah was given, as we noticed here, discernment to see the threats for what they were. It'd be easy for us to read this and say, boy, I wished I had that same kind of discernment. We think about Nehemiah's discernment, reminds us of Jesus, who was put in a similar situation so many times. One in particular I think of in Matthew 22, verse 18, where Jesus, trying to be trapped by the religious leaders, says, perceiving their malice, he said, why are you testing me, hypocrites? Jesus had that supernatural, spirit-inspired discernment. And we know that we need it as well if we're going to survive the testing, the temptation, and so forth. I'm reminded of James 1:5 that gives us hope, that gives us a promise, that if any of you lacks wisdom, he should ask God, who gives to all generously and without criticizing, and it will be given to him. So if we size ourselves up according to Nehemiah and say, I don't think I could be that discerning, if we think of Jesus and the entrapment efforts, and to say I can't be that discerning, when we face those kinds of things from our enemy, James 1:5 says, if we don't have the wisdom we need, then we simply ask God, and God, without accusing, will generously give that to us. And so we can claim that promise. We certainly do well to face down the enemy tactics, as Nehemiah did, with prayer. Time and time again, we're reminded as a man of prayer how he faced those things down, saying things like, now, O God, strengthen my hands, and remember Tobiah and Sanballat and all those things they've done to try to intimidate. We too can realize that specific bullet prayers like he prayed can and are very, very effective. So I'm thinking that if Nehemiah could stand before us here today, things that he would say to us, both from his words and from his example here in chapter 6, I believe these are the things he would say based on what we have studied this morning. Number one, I believe he would say, stay on task, and especially when the goal is within reach, when the resistance is the greatest, stay on task. Let nothing deter you. Secondly, I think that he would say, beware of the danger of compromising with the enemy. Beware of those meetings where you would sit down and try to hammer out something that involves compromise. Like we said a little bit ago, that place where the meeting was to take place, this is our motto, we say no to oh no. When there are those oh no kind of places, we say no to them. I will not compromise. Thirdly, I believe he would say this, seek discernment in knowing the true intent behind the accusations and the intimidation. Things are not always as they seem. And so seek out that discernment. Again, remember the promise in James. Ask God for that wisdom. Fourthly, I believe he would say, especially be on guard against subtle efforts to compromise and discredit. Not all the efforts of the enemy are blatant and easy to see. There are subtle ones. And so be especially on guard for them. Fifthly, I think he would say, be aware that some enemy assaults will come from inside the camp as well as those from outside. those who are masquerading around within. And that can be a pretty effective tactic. Be very, very careful concerning those things. And finally, I think that he would say that in every situation, respond ASAP, an acronym for always say a prayer, as we learn from him. So again, like Nehemiah, may we always stay on task, great work. May we never, ever let anything distract or deter us from that great work.